Welcome to the Magical Salon, where two regular people, Amanda and James, explore mystical ideas and big questions. From books to pop culture, if it's a doorway to something deeper, we're probably into it. We're not experts, and maybe you aren't either, but that's kind of the point. Welcome back to the Magical Salon. I'm your wizened storyteller, Amanda.
And I'm your assistant storyteller, James. I also was going to be a storyteller, but I didn't have the wizened adjective in there.
It's because I'm older than you. So this week's episode is going to be about parables, which, if you're unfamiliar, are essentially short stories that relay a moral, spiritual, and or ethical lesson. Many sort of associate parables with Christianity, but they're found in a variety of spiritualities and even in pop culture. So two parables often cited in pop culture are the Tortoise and the Hare and the Boy Who Cried Wolf. These are both Aesop fables and stories that people may be familiar with, but they actually have a deeper moral meaning. So the question for my co-host and assistant storyteller: why do you think parables are relied on so heavily, both in religion and in pop culture? What's the draw to them, do you think?
I think really it comes down to stories are what people remember the best. If you think of them being used to relay or demonstrate a moral lesson specifically, you can tell a kid, don't steal, or keep at it, try harder, right? But then ultimately it's kind of boring and you forget about it, but it's like, oh, you know, there's a race and you might not be fast as the hare, but if you keep going, little Billy, maybe you can win. Maybe you could be that tortoise. And if you just stick to it, little buddy, you can win. It's a way to, you can relay pretty deep things, but I also think the thing that's cool with parables is you can kind of reference it very quickly. And just saying the tortoise and the hare, that's 3 words, but there's kind of a lot underneath it. So in just common parlance, it's easy to refer to a parable to relay a specific message or meaning very quickly to an audience, assuming they are also familiar with the parable, that is. Why do you think parables are kind of interesting or so prominent, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's because it's about the power of story, which I think we've talked about before on the podcast. Anything couched in a story holds attention longer and is also more memorable. And I also think lessons imparted through story are easily held on to and in some way give you kind of a way to experience the failing in the story, but also the lesson. Because, you know, there's like always that saying, some people learn things the hard way, which means that you have to mess up a lot of times before you actually start learning things. But I think in some ways, everybody's kind of like that, and parables are sort of like a medium, a way for you to experience it and fail at it through the story's course, but also get the lesson.
It does, and I think the other thing that's cool about parables is they're very malleable in that these are old stories, but the underlying message can be, or meaning, or lesson can be applied today still to a variety of different things. So in sports, this is a real David versus Goliath matchup. The underdog, everybody roots for the underdog. You still use that even though sports aren't really the initial meaning of it. It's still kind of relaying the idea. And I think the other idea that I wanted to touch on was, I think that they're cool because stories are for the heart. So when you hear like winning over hearts and minds, I think minds is all facts and data, which is kind of boring. But if you can tell a good story, instead of like, oh,
we're 4.3% more productive than our competitors,
we're gonna overcome all odds and do whatever. Like one way you're trying to rationally appeal to someone versus through a story, you're kind of speaking to their heart or their emotion, I guess, rather than rationality. And I think despite how much people like to say they are rational, we aren't that rational. And ultimately stories do just stick better and they are more convincing most of the time.
I don't think it has to do with rationality. I think that when you're telling a story, you're appealing to the human part of another person because humans are storytellers. They share their own stories as well as the stories of others. I mean, just think about cave paintings, stories told like under the cover of night or during storms to pass the time, Greek mythology, and even like origin stories. Like a lot of the things that we believe at a core level, either about ourselves or about the way the world works, are told to us through stories.
I think that is interesting because you were kind of listing some of the ideas, circumstances when stories are told, but even campfire stories, ghost stories, stories keep you going in a lot of the way. It's the story you tell yourself to motivate yourself, but also the story others are telling you, kind of in a weird way, current reality. You're kind of living in the story, right? You are helping write the current story for the country, for history. We're just kind of hammering home stories are important, but parables are a specific kind of story. And I just think it's cool to think of how common they are. Yet you're kind of unaware of how common they are until you start paying attention to it. Like David versus Goliath, that happens all the time in movies. Pandora's box, especially with AI and stuff now, it's like, oh, be careful, don't like open the box. You don't know what might come out.
Well, it's interesting, just as a little tidbit, like when I was a kid, Chick-fil-A used to be even more religious than it is now. Because when you would get a kids meal at Chick-fil-A, they would give you like these tiny little cassette tapes. And in the cassette tapes were basically a bunch of parables and like religious teachings for the children. It was basically like propaganda by a corporation. But I thought it was interesting, like you would not really see that today.
Well, I mean, that just kind of sounds like Veggie Tales then too, though, right? Where they were just talking like cucumber and tomato or whatever they were.
I just think it's funny because, I mean, I'm not that old, but the fact that I got like tiny little cassette tapes of my Happy Meal toy at Chick-fil-A is like just kind of interesting to think about.
Parables in some ways allow you to see into and kind of hear what types of points or lessons society is trying to impart. So in the instance of Chick-fil-A, they're trying to give you like biblical parables and stories. So they're trying to teach you biblical lessons because that's their aim, which I think is interesting because you can kind of, in some ways, learn about cultures or mythology within cultures based on what stories they tell.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like gods reflect their believers, like stories reflect the beliefs of the people that are telling them, right? But I just think it's interesting because I think people do really heavily associate parables with Christianity, but they're not exclusive to Christianity. Like the Quran has a bunch of parables, which are called mashal. Similar to the Bible, like they appear like throughout, and like Buddhism, Hinduism, they're a lot more widely seen than people might often think.
Well, I think that kind of just gets back to the idea of stories being powerful, and that's one of the things that religions kind of have in common is they do tell a story. It's kind of a compendium of stories teaching the moral lessons instead of just, the Bible isn't just 10 commandments on a tablet. It's not one page, right? It's really long. And all of these books are long because they're kind of trying to teach the moral lesson through events that occur in a day-to-day life. What happens when an old lady's trying to cross the road? What do you do? Do you turn your back on her? Or are you a good Samaritan that helps? In some ways, cultivate a ideal moral person.
Not all parables, even if you use from the Bible, like it's not like Jesus appears in every parable. He's often the one telling the parables because someone has a question about a certain thing. So this is like my deep dive into the story of the Good Samaritan. Someone basically asks Jesus, like, who is my neighbor? And then he launches into the story of the Good Samaritan, Like, and everyone's probably heard the story of like this guy who was like beat up and left for dead on the side of the road, and various people walk past him seeing like that he's clearly in need of help, and they don't help him, including like a priest like walks by and doesn't like help him or whatever. It kind of reminds me of the show like What Would You Do that used to come on TV, where people would be doing horrible things and they would see whether anyone would intervene. It's kind of like the bystander effect. It's interesting because like a good Samaritan means something in larger culture, but in the actual original parable there's additional context. Namely, that the person needing help is Jewish, and the person who helps them is a Samaritan, which is a member of an ethno-religious group. And they believe they're descendants of ancient Israelites. And they often claim Israeli and Palestinian citizenship. But basically, the interesting part is that in the story, you know, a Jewish priest comes by, doesn't help the man. And it's this person who, on the face of it, may not have anything in common with the person in need. There's a divide. There may even be historical tensions, right? But who is my neighbor? It's everyone, right? It's, you know, you're helping everyone. It's a person that no one would expect to help that does. And so, I don't know, I was just kind of thinking about how, I mean, not to hammer it over the head too much, but it's kind of like what I said in the Odyssey podcast about how there's something to learn from all religions, because like that's such an interesting story, and I think there are like a lot of good lessons in it. But I think a lot of times people, I don't know, like once you start following an institutional religion, you know, sometimes people just start dictating what it is you should be believing, rather than here are the parables and the stories, find the meaning within and follow that. Like, here are the actual teachings, rather than, oh, here's a single quote that I've plucked out of this specific part of the text that could be manipulated to mean pretty much anything.
There's a lot. I do like the Good Samaritan story, and that's a very famous one, right? And again, it's kind of implying anybody could be the Good Samaritan.
But it's also implying that most people are not the Good Samaritan.
I think that's an interesting way of interpreting it, though, because the idea of it ultimately is anyone could be your savior, I guess, in this instance. Don't count anyone out, or don't assume the worst of anyone, because it's kind of getting back to like judging a book on its cover. You would assume the priest would help. Nope.
Yeah, which applies both ways, because you have certain associations about people, i.e. if you saw the priest, you'd probably think, oh, well, I have a pretty good chance of them helping me because they're like a so-called good person. But it's like the titles you hold in life have no bearing on like what your status as a so-called good person.
Which is interesting, because the titles are completely irrelevant, right? Which, to say nothing of like the afterlife or heaven or hell or whatever, but the idea of your actions, going back to the Good Samaritan, are what matter. So you could be a nobody Samaritan neighbor that just helps somebody, versus I'm a priest. I don't need to help because I'm a priest. Obviously I'm getting in. You could kind of fall into that trap where the title and status are, to you, they're kind of like the excuse to not need to do the deeds, to actually live the way you're supposed to, because you've got a certain prestige.
Right. Again, like what we've talked about with what are the motivations for doing good deeds? You know, there's an argument that could be said where it's like, well, you know, if nobody's watching, like, why should I have to do this thing? Right? Because there's like a performative element to it, especially for some religious people, not all, obviously. It's like, oh, well, you know, I want people to see me being this great person, and then they will know how amazing I am. Whereas like the Good Samaritan in this parable, nobody's watching. I feel like it's kind of illustrating a deeper truth, which is like, there is such a thing as morals, even though people seem to try and argue that.
Well, I think that's ultimately what is interesting about them to me. Because people now, it's like, oh, morality's dead, there's no truth or whatever. But it's like, in some ways, that's why the magic and the beauty of these parables, they're such simple stories, But whenever you listen to it or hear it, because of their prominence, I guess, or how well known most of them are, it just resonates, but you also know what should be done. And that, to me, is how you know there is a moral.
But I think that's true in life. Sometimes things are not so cut and dry, but a lot of times I think you know what the right thing is to do. It's not always easy to do, and it may conflict with your other interests, so to speak, right?
Do you have a favorite parable?
I mean, I have two others I could discuss, but I don't know if you have any that you wanted to mention.
I mean, I think I already called out the David and Goliath, but I mean, that's just the ultimate underdog. That's always a good one. Specifically the tortoise and the hare being explained to me, not in a race context, but I feel like sometimes for homework, because I would rush through it as fast as possible, do crappy on it. And I'd be like, just go a little bit slower, and you will ultimately end up spending less time on this. If you just take your time, you'll learn it better. It will be correct on the first go. So you didn't sprint through it, get them all wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also about arrogance, because the hare is very, so confident that he's gonna win that, doesn't he,
He takes naps or something, yeah.
So these are both Buddhist parables. So this first one I just discovered as I was preparing for this app, but I thought it was interesting, and I'll explain why. It's basically a man is shot with a poisoned arrow, and he refuses to seek treatment until he knows the details about the archer as well as the arrow's composition. So the lesson is that the Buddha explains that the dying man would die before getting all of his answers, i.e., you should focus on alleviating your present suffering and finding liberation and peace with that, rather than getting caught up in unresolved metaphysical questions. It's an interesting connection to Ursula Le Guin's unanswerable questions, which she talks about in The Left Hand of Darkness. I think, ultimately in this scenario, he's so focused on trying to figure out the cause of all these things and why. If I just know all the information and the facts, then I will know everything there is to know. But it's not about that, right? It's about focusing on the present and making peace with the things that you cannot know, because that is what brings peace, not actually having all the answers, because that is impossible.
Yeah, it is impossible to know all the answers, but in some ways it's almost like our societal issue is people are unable to handle ambiguity or unknowing. You just kind of burn yourself out if you're always trying on an individual level, but also a cultural level. If you're always trying to dissect things more and more and more and more, you're just never being in the moment.
Yeah, well, I was laughing because for some reason I was thinking about this the other day. I guess I was Googling something because we recently got back from a trip and our dogs were super excited to see us. And I was just looking up, do dogs really miss you when you're gone, sort of? And I was kind of a bunch of stuff, there had been literal studies that were conducted on this subject. And I was just thinking to myself, is this really necessary? If you think about all the problems in the world and how there's limited money and resources, why are we as a society spending money and resources on finding out the answer to that question, which is completely irrelevant and really helps no one? That's a waste of time, money, and resources in my mind. That can just be an unanswerable question.
You can't really evaluate happiness, for instance, right? That's not a scale. You can't say people are happier than they were then, because it's well, what people? Are you comparing the same people? Is it a different? It's all the data stuff is oh, well, GDP is up, so therefore people are doing better. But that's not how people live and experience the world, which again is why I think the parables are so impactful, because it's more you can tell a story through a parable or explain a situation you overcame as if it were a parable, and that has way more chances of resonating and kind of spreading or disseminating to other people than I tell somebody some great fact that says they should be happier, but it's well, if they don't feel it, that doesn't mean anything to them. That's just a made up statistic. Where'd you get that data from?
In regards to happiness, our culture is so obsessed with happiness, and to the point where they've made it like a quest. Oh, I just need to be happy. If I could only be happy, right? It's always out there, it's always externalized. It's something you can never get, but something you're always looking for and seeking. And when you can't get it, you're upset. But it's because happiness is not a thing that can ever be obtained at all points of time. Really, what you should be seeking is peace, because peace encapsulates everything. Like life encapsulates everything. You're not always going to be joyful at every point of the day. Things are going to happen that upset you, that make you sad. There's going to be grief and suffering. Like that's just part of life. But if you can find a way to make peace with all of those things, that is what you should be striving for. But it's also something inward. It's not an external thing. So you can actually obtain it. Whereas if you're seeking happiness, you might do a bunch of different stuff in search of something, this ephemeral thing that you don't even understand.
Do you think there is, in some ways, a danger or risk to parables then, by that logic, or stories? You're externalizing it through the story. It's, I'm a hero. Well, if you're a hero, aren't you kind of inherently competing against someone then? And David versus Goliath, well, if you're David, then who's Goliath? Do you know what I mean? And I'm sure the person that is Goliath in your story does not view themselves as Goliath. So in some ways, that's how you kind of get conflict, I guess you could say almost.
I think that's just ego at the end of the day. Like, I think assigning people certain roles and calling yourself a hero is sort of like a bastardization of the parable. You're missing the point of the parable, I think. No one views themselves as a hero, or you shouldn't, right? Like, are there certain moments in time where you might act really well or really godlike, or you might be a hero to someone else? So someone else might perceive you as a hero. But I don't think a hero is ever something you should perceive yourself as, because then you're just going into godlike ego territory.
You were talking about the Buddhist parable and kind of relating that to Le Guin's unanswerable questions. So what would you say then to the Doubting Thomas parable? What's the parable, Doubting Thomas? Don't question God? Like, does that not seem like there's some risk there? Like, just be dumb and listen to what the boss tells you.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the story, right, like, so Jesus has all these disciples, and most, if not all of them, believe that he rose from the dead, right? I think that's what it is. Except for Thomas, he doesn't believe because he can't see it with his own eyes, and thus he doesn't believe that it's real. And so Jesus like shows him like the marks on his hands from where he was crucified, and then Thomas believes. I don't think you can extrapolate it out to be like, oh, it means like you should just obey everything and not question anything. I think it's more so very specifically understood in the context of spirituality, right? Like, there is such a thing as true belief, and true belief does not require proof.
The Doubting Thomas is kind of a story of faith, really, then.
So he's almost like a scientist or something in this day and age. Like, he's like, oh, I need to have like the physical proof. Like, you know, like it's like we've talked about before, like scientists and spiritual seekers are often trying to discover the same things, but through different ways. And I think there's an argument to be made that if you're coming from it from a very science-based perspective, you have to prove everything and show all your sources and stuff. Like, are you not sort of a Doubting Thomas because you need some kind of proof to believe anything?
That is interesting, because the idea of a Doubting Thomas in the modern world, everyone's a Doubting Thomas about everything. You can show people videos now and they will say that's not true, it's AI, that's Photoshop. So now, how do you prove anything? Like, everyone is an ultimate Doubting Thomas, especially when you're presenting them, in some cases, proof or facts that they don't want to believe or they do not want to hear. Then that is an interesting parable then, especially for the modern age, as being more prescient, especially now the way you framed it.
Yeah, and I think also to kind of riff on something that I did see on TikTok, an interview with Ocean Vuong, who's a poet, and also a professor. He was just talking about how many of his students are like proud cynics. They refuse to care about anything. They shit on everything because it's cool to be a cynic. Cynicism is associated with intelligence, and questioning things is associated with intelligence. And so they're happy to have those associations applied to them, but it's no longer cool when you want something so much and you have a lot of belief in yourself and you still fail. Like, and he's talking about this from a writing perspective, right? So he's got a lot of students who are cynics. They don't want to have anyone know that they really have a dream and they really want something because they're afraid that they won't get it. So instead they pretend not to care about anything. And I think a lot of people are like that today, especially with social media. Like, oh, well, I'm just going to sort of criticize everything and, you know, I'm too cool to care about anything. But at the end of the day, are you even really trying? Like, what are you doing? It sounds like you're almost just sort of treading water. Well, I just think in general, especially like in this highly commercialized Western world that we're living in, like us personally, I feel like there's little room for unexplained phenomenon, but many things are unexplained. And I mean, it kind of goes to the unanswerable questions, but it's also like, why do we feel this need to try and explain everything? And if you do ever experience something that you can't explain, a lot of people, like the cynics, for example, will not believe you. Like, just think about all the people that have had out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences. It's like, oh, well, we can't, like, prove that, so it didn't happen. There's more to experience, I think, than what you can prove.
And I think that's ultimately a limitation of just being human, which people are not okay with that, though. Ambiguity and feeling like things are out of your control, specifically. And I kind of think it's amplified by the internet to some extent because you're aware of so much and you have virtually no control over almost everything you're aware of. I think one of the ways you kind of cope with it is by becoming a doubting Thomas or a skeptic, or you become a cynic or a nihilistic because you're so inundated with stuff and things that have no bearing on your life, mostly. But they can still move you, upset you, take up your mental space, and ruin your day if you're reading about depressing things in the news or all this external stuff. It can just kind of suck you away, I guess, from just living your life and telling your own story, which I think is an interesting idea for a parable, being like, it's kind of a mythologizing of your own story. You could think of parables as a way for you to examine your life story. Like, how would you tell your life? And do you live it, or are you trying to impart something or leave something that others could then tell so that you could become a story, like the Good Samaritan?
Yeah, well, that's like the whole idea of like 15 seconds of fame. Like, people are so afraid of nobody ever thinking about them and people forgetting them that they like go to all these different lengths to become a person that will not be forgotten. I mean, even just think about the concept of notoriety, right? Like, infamous for things, like even in a bad case, right? Most people, there's nothing wrong with being somebody that is pretty much completely unknown. Like, not everybody, there's like just as much value in that as there is to being a hero in a story. Because if you think about it, like a hero in a story, that's like a moment of their life. It's just a fragment of their life. It doesn't really embody or encapsulate them as an actual person. So in some ways, it's like, I don't know, it's like seeing a sliver of someone rather than a person represented in their entirety.
There was some type of parable or something I was listening to about like a plum tree. Basically, nobody looks at this plum. Like, let's imagine we have a plum tree in our front yard. We are never going to look at that plum tree like, I wish that plum tree was the best plum tree in the entire world. I wish that had the most fruit. It was indestructible. It was 3,000 feet tall. Just an insane whatever. I think kind of one of the reasons for people's malaise and unhappiness is because everybody is not okay to just be a plum tree. Like, you just turn with the seasons, you have some fruit, then you don't, you lose your leaves, then they grow back. You just kind of live this cycle as the plum tree. That's all you are. But people can't just be a person. It's like, I have to be the best business person that ever walked the world. This constant one-upmanship that's kind of, in some ways, story-driven, because people are trying to tell a story about themselves, but not necessarily I wouldn't want to say the right story, but it's not a story that everybody can live.
That's good. I thought about the plum tree. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like in that I think it's Mark Manson's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Like, he just talks about how people just care too much about everything, and because you're caring so much about everything, there's little room to care about the things that you should actually be caring about. And he also talks about how, like, there's nothing wrong with being like an unnamed, completely forgettable person. Yeah, like, you're a plum tree, and you should try and be happy with that, right? Or be at peace with that at the very least, because all this striving is like extremely draining. I have my last parable if you want to hear it.
Sure.
So this I also found through TikTok. It's a Buddhist parable known as the gift of anger. It's basically about a really angry man that approaches the Buddha. He's like shouting at him and trying to provoke a reaction from him, but the Buddha's like calm and completely unaffected. And so then at some point, the guy's like, why am I not upsetting you? Like, why am I not getting a reaction out of you? And the Buddha just says, if you buy a gift for someone and that person does not take it, to whom does the gift belong? Like, he's comparing his anger to like an unwanted gift. So it's like, if you're really angry,
I don't have to accept your anger, kind of.
It belongs to you, not to me.
That's good.
So, but it's a good lesson, because it's like, if someone is like angry at you, you kind of have two choices. You can accept the anger and also be mad, but if you don't accept it, then it's a reflection on them and it falls back on them and it doesn't come to you at all.
It's kind of like the I'm rubber and you're glue or something, almost, right? But there's something funny and simple about it. They're not really wrong either. And that's kind of the idea of the map of like, you don't have to get bogged down in lower fear-based reality. You can just be above it. You can be like, yeah, that guy's not in a good mood. I'm just gonna not worry about that person, right?
So in conclusion, it's cool to care. You should care more, but only if you want to.
Don't be a doubting Thomas.
And come back to the Magical Salon for more stories and more sides next week. Show notes in the description, because I don't think we ever mentioned the show notes, and they're pretty cool. So go get some points down in the show notes. Compete with oneself.